Hey, welcome. I am super duper stoked to talk about something that actually relates directly to the Daf Yomi. So, hi, I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. This is the 47th episode of the JewishDrinking.com podcast and video show. We are talking about Eruvin 64 and 65. Not the most intriguing of titles, and yet very on the nose when it comes to what we're talking about. Both sides of 64 and 65 in Eruvin are there's a lot about wine, and these are it's a pretty serious and significant sugya, a pericope, discussion about wine in the Talmud. Definitely one of the most significant, one of the most programmatic discussions about wine and drinking in the entire corpus of rabbinic literature. So I'm really excited about this. And for you Daf Yomiists, Daf Yomians, I don't know what the nomenclature is for you out there. This is obviously very timely, whether it's for today on Monday when this episode is being released, or Tuesday, this following day when you're covering Eruvin 65. By the way, this is a timely episode. I'm very excited about this, and let's just dive in. So I'm actually going to do a lot of screen sharing, so if you're interested, if you're curious, this is a Sefaria sheet. I've got it available on Sefaria, and here, but also the Talmud is also on Sefaria. It's out there. Okay. I'm really excited because we're going to kick things off, and here we go. We are getting started on Eruvin 64a with this statement. Rav Yehuda Shmuel said, one who drank a quarter log of wine may not issue a halachic ruling. They may not issue halachic guidance. Now, the very first thing we have to talk about is the quantity. What is this quarter log? So for visual purposes, I hope this helps everybody. I have here a quarter log of it's actually mead, not wine, but a quarter log. It's the same quantity, even if it's a different quaff. And this is some mead. Depending upon how you calculate things, it's usually a few ounces. Literally a few ounces, somewhere between 3-ish and maybe 4-ish. And I've seen people try to quantify it between like 2.7 and 5-ish, whatever. It's usually about 3, and 3 plus, I would say. And what it's a quarter of is basically it's a quarter of 6 eggs. So I remember a few years back, I took 6 eggs. I put them, actually I might have taken 3 eggs. I might have put 3 eggs, displaced the water, and I ended up ultimately with the calculation of like 3 1/3, basically. So this is what it is. This is the amount. No. This is some mead I'll be drinking while we talk. But one thing, here we go. All right, some lovely local mead. Really excited. So Rav Yehuda quoted Shmuel, once you drink that much. Now, it's really fascinating when we think about this amount, which I haven't delved into in depth yet on JewishDrinking.com, as far as this interesting quantity. What is this 3 1/3 ounces that we're talking about? Well, this seems to be a significant amount. It's the amount that we need to drink for the 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder. It's for basically any ceremonial ritual act involving wine is this quantity, actually. Okay, so then Rav Nachman, I find this deeply amusing. He comes along, he says, this is not excellent because I need to drink at least a quarter log of wine before I can even start to think. How can you forbid me? I have no wiggle room here, right? If I need at least a quarter log, at least this amount, to even begin to offer a ruling, and then you're saying once I hit that, I cap out, what's going on? So Rava said to him, what are you talking about? Because didn't Rabbi Yachal Baruch Hanina say, he talks about this thing, but ultimately Rav Nachman says, all right, I take it back. I'm sorry I said that. I still love Rav Nachman's statement, though. I mean, it's incredibly clever, which is at least give me this much, get my mind going, right? There's a certain intellectual stimulation that comes along with drinking, and whether you're like me, you're drinking mead, or as I often prefer beer. But in Rav Nachman's case, wine, I think he ultimately he admitted and recanted, but still, it's an interesting proffering to put forward. Okay, so that's really the opening salvo, as it were, of the sugya, because now things start getting rolling, because we're going to get Now that we talked about offering halachic guidance, we're going to go into prayer. What about drinking and praying? Or as I like to think about it, praying under the influence. So we have another Amoraic text. We have Rabba bar Rav Huna, who says, one who has drunk or has consumed some sort of alcoholic content should not pray. But what happens if they did? Well, then their prayer counts. That's fine. You know, you had a little bit, you prayed, that's cool. That counts. But what if you're drunk? Well, if you're drunk, you also should not be praying. But if you did, it doesn't count. It's disgusting. It's abominable. That's the problem, according to Rabba bar Rav Huna, that you cannot be drunk and pray. That's not cool. Now, I know you're going to say, what is the distinction between the two, between simply drinking and being drunk, right? Where is that line? Is it a fine line? Is it a big gray area? What's the difference? So we have more on Eruvin 64a, and we have this little story. Rabbi Abba bar Shumni and Rav Menashe bar Yirmiyah from Gifty were leaving each other at the ford of the Yofti River, and they said, hey, let's each of us say something that one has not yet heard. For Mari bar, okay. So we go on. So one of them, not clear which of the two, but one of them said, what are the circumstances where one has drunk wine, right? We have Heiche dami shatoi v'heiche dami shikor. What's the distinction between the two, right? How can we say? So one says, Kol shiachol l'daber lifnei hamelech. Shikor kol she'enu yachol l'daber lifnei hamelech. The distinction, the differentiation is, can one speak in front of a king? That's it. Can you address a king? Can you speak when you're drunk and you're slurring your words? That's clearly problematic. And that one's, someone in that situation, that person's prayer is abominable. It's not good according to the rabbis. But if you are still able to speak, you got some drinking on, can still speak before God, before the king, you're okay with your prayers. Okay. So that's really interesting. I will say there is a parallel text in the Yerushalmi that has pretty much the exact same the line. We have a parallel in the Yerushalmi where we have Abba bar Rav Huna saying one who drank shouldn't pray, and if they did, it counts. If they're drunk, you shouldn't, and if it did, it's not good, right? The prayer is blasphemous. But the difference here is that whereas in the Bavli it was a subjective measurement as to the ability for one to speak before the king, the Yerushalmi offers us an objective measurement that once you have, again, a revis, this quarter lobe, which I mentioned, the few ounces, boom. It's this like very, very minimal measurement, and then boom, that's out. But what's really, really fascinating here in the Yerushalmi is they also offer what they are saying over in Babylonia, that over there, what they say is all who are unable to speak before the king is. So the Yerushalmi actually mentions both the objective measurement as well as the subjective measurement of the Bavli. So that's a really neat thing. Okay, now we then move on to, now that we have this that we talked about, once we've discussed now in the Bavli, we talked about prayer, which is if you've been drinking, you shouldn't pray, but if you have, that's okay. If you are drunk, you really should not be praying, and if you did, that's a really bad thing. Now we're going to move on, which is, well, what about dispelling the effects of wine? Okay, what if you have been drinking, you still want to pray? How can you, I don't know, get rid of the buzzedness, as it were? So Rami bar Abba said, walking a path of a mill and sleeping, even a minimal amount will dispel the effect of wine. And then Rav Nachman said, Rabba bar Avua said, they only taught this if you only had this quarter lobe of wine, right? This few ounces, which I've been working on. So it's actually now probably less than 3 ounces at this point. And then you could, if you did only drink this quarter lobe, then a path will preoccupy them, and they'll get sleepy and become more drunk if you actually have more than a few ounces. So if you've had a few drinks, sleeping it off is actually not going to aid you in quickly sobering up. So that's just not going to work for you. Now, we have this really interesting text here. We have a Tanaitic text of this incident involving Rabban Gamliel. Now, this incident involving Rabban Gamliel is actually not unique to the Bavli. It actually occurs in the Bavli. It occurs in the Yerushalmi. It occurs in the Tosefta. It occurs in Halachic Midrash. So this is somehow a memorable text, a memorable Tannaitic text that gets planted throughout rabbinic literature, and it's certainly significant as far as where wine is involved. I'm not going to go more into it, at least not now. We could dedicate a whole other episode just to this one text. I'm going to skip through all the stuff that doesn't have anything to do with drinking and move right on into, boom, Rabban Gamliel arriving in Kaziv. Person came to request he dissolve his vow, and Rabban Gamliel said to the one who was with him, hey, oh, by the way, did we drink a quarter log of Italian wine? Oh, that's right. We somewhere along the road we were drinking. Yeah, that happened. And so you know what? Let's let him walk after us. We'll wait for our wine to be dispelled. So they went for 3 mil until Rabban Gamliel arrived at the ladder of Tyre. Having arrived there, he alighted from his donkey, wrapped himself, and sat and dissolved his vow. So somehow this time, getting fresh air, riding on the donkey, was able to dispel the effects of his drinking. Now, and this is really fascinating. It's actually still part of the Baraita. It's still part of this Tannaitic material. At that time, we learned many matters. We learned that a quarter log of Italian wine intoxicates, and we learned that one who is intoxicated may not issue a halachic ruling, and we learned that one who walks on a path dispels the effect of wine. And finally, we learned that one may not annul vows when either mounted on an animal, walking, or even standing, but only while sitting. So the serious things are a quarter log of Italian wine intoxicates, and you cannot issue a halachic ruling while having had some of this. And of course, the final is walking helps dispel the effects of drinking. So there's an interesting aftermath here in the Bavli about this. And one of the things is they say, what about maybe Italian wine, right? Maybe Italian wine is somehow different in its quality. Maybe, and you could go either way. You could say either it's more intoxicating or less intoxicating. So they say, wait a second, what, the Stamayim, the nameless sages of the Talmud say Italian wine is different, since it's more intoxicating, meaning, and by the way, the implication is that if Italian wine is more intoxicating, then more local, maybe Israeli or Babylonian wine would actually be less intoxicating. Therefore, more than these few ounces would have to cross that threshold. But didn't Rav Nachman say that Rabba Bar Avuha said they only taught with regard to a quarter log of wine? And all this and that, yeah, but being mounted on a different animal is different. Okay, so according to Rami Bar Abba, it's okay, whatever, writing's different. But ultimately, what one of the biggest pieces of this is this, again, this quarter log, this few ounces is really where you shouldn't be giving halachic advice. So we've talked about not giving halachic advice, which really takes us really back to the beginning of this entire sugya, as well as not praying. That's pretty important. Although the Bavli does, allow some leeway as ability. You could have a few of those reviewed. You could have a few of maybe 10 ounces. Who knows? As long as you were still able to speak before the king. All right. Limits of prayer. More on praying under the influence. So now this goes in a very different direction. What we saw earlier in the Amorite text was the Rabba Bar Rav Huna text was, can you, right? Now, here's a very different sense. Are you obligated still? So we have this Tannaitic text. One who is drunk, their acquisition is an acquisition, their sale is a sale. But, and actually, if you committed a transgression for which you're liable for the death penalty, you're executed. And if by lashes, they're flogged. And here's the general principle. One is like a sober person in all matters, except they are exempt from prayer. So basically, whatever you do, you're still like any other person while drunk, except you have an exemption from prayer. Very neat. This is, I should mention, this has a parallel in the Tosefta of Terumot, which is pretty much very similar, except it leaves out this exemption from prayer. But nevertheless, this is the text as we find it in the Babylonian Talmud, that all these different things, but the main thing is that they are like a healthy person. They just are exempt from prayer. Now, this actually makes sense because we actually see in Mishnah Brachot that there are several cases for people who are in various situations in which they have things going on in their lives that they cannot fully devote their attention to praying. They are bogged down. They have other things going in their minds that they cannot properly give the mental attention to praying. Well, guess what? That's the same case here. That's exactly how this text fits in with those texts over in Mishnah Brachot, that certain people in certain situations can find themselves to be exempt from prayer. Okay, so I find this deeply fascinating, that if one's drunk, you are exempt from prayer. And then once you lay over that Rabba Bar of Huna piece of it, which is you're already exempt once you're drunk, what are you doing praying now? Whatever comes out of your mouth is garbled as far as the attention, the attention and intention that you have to your words and what's coming out. It's really not what should be happening. And just be at peace in your drunkenness and don't bother praying. Really fascinating. We then have this MRI clarification. Rabbi Chanina said they only taught this text that we just mentioned when one has not reached the state of intoxication of lot, which is a really significant intoxication in chapter 19 in the book of Genesis. However, if he reached the state of intoxication of lot, he's exempt from all liability. So there's regular drunkenness, and then there's the intoxication of lot. Really fascinatingly, the intoxication of lot story in 19th chapter of Genesis actually doesn't even use the language of drunk. It really just says that Lot didn't know when his daughters were going up and down. Like, he just didn't know. He was so far gone, although it's clear from the text he was super duper drunk. Nevertheless, so for here, Rabbi Chanina says, look, you got to have some leeway for someone who's drunk. You can't just say, like, are all drunks created equally? Can we judge all? Can we judge all drunks equally? That's really the someone in a drunken stupor. So there's a certain level of drunkenness that we still say they are culpable to a limit. But then once you hit Lot's drunkenness, in which you really just have no sense of what's flying, boom, you somehow get out of even your purchases somehow are not really considered a purchase. Okay, now this is kind of funny. Sort of we end the second section second section, which is praying with booze around. So Shmuel's father would return from his journey and wouldn't pray for 3 days, probably because he wasn't in the right mindset, or maybe he was tired, maybe he was exhausted. We have Shmuel himself not praying in a house that contained beer. If there was a house that had beer in it, he wouldn't pray. Now, presumably, I understand this as having to do with the smell of the beer. The smell of the beer gives it to be it's basically problematic for Shmuel. Somehow not everybody likes the smell of beer. That happens. Really fascinating. The other person involved in this conversation is Rav Papa, who wouldn't pray in a house that contains small fish. What's deeply fascinating on two levels about Rav Papa here is we all know that fish can smell horrifically, and that can affect one's mindset for sure. Rav Papa was not bothered by beer being in a house. Why not? Because Rav Papa was the big beer baron of the Bavli. And you can see another episode that I did with Professor Jordan Rosenblum on Rav Papa and beer in the Babylonian Talmud for more on this. And so that's what's really deeply fascinating, that Rav Papa wasn't bothered by beer. That was his livelihood. Shmuel, however, beer, even just the scent, it seems, couldn't pray in such a house. Okay. Now we move on to what I like to call Roman numeral 3 here, is the general statements about wine. This is where it gets really fun. We've talked about prayer. We've talked about offering halachic guidance. Now we get to talk about general statements about wine, and these are so deeply fascinating. The first one is Rabbi Chanina, who says, whomever is appeased by one's wine has in them the mindset of his creator, as it is stated, and the Lord smelled the sweet savor, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Really fascinating. I don't really fully know what this means. I haven't fully gone in depth with Rabbi Chanina on this statement, but basically, you're cool with wine, that somehow you've got the mindset of God. You've achieved it to some degree, which is such a cool midrash on this. Just like, I'm chill with my wine, man, which is that's super cool. Okay. Similarly, Rabbi Chia says, Kol hamityashe b'yeino yesh bo das shivim zikanim. Anybody who remains settled of mind after drinking wine has the mindset of the 70 elders. And the way you get it is wine, which has the gematria, the Hebrew numerical equivalents of 70, right? It's with 70 letters, and also sod, right? Sod, which is secret, or like it's certainly a depth of knowledge, has a similar numerical equivalency, this Gemara. So, and then it finishes off with these four words, Nichnas yain yatsa sod. Wine enters and secrets depart, right? So that, or a secret emerges. So basically, just as there's wisdom, right? There's deep wisdom with the 70 elders, so too when you insert wine, which has this same numerical equivalency as secrets, and then those come out. It's interesting because it could, you could on the one hand talk about how much of it is this wisdom, like this comparison to the 70 elders is like they have such deep wisdom and knowledge, and you know, with wine, and you're cool with it, right? Kol hamityashe b'yeino, you're like chill with wine, then you can acquire this deep knowledge, right? You're cool. You're not wild and crazy, but you're reserved, and you're happy to share your wisdom and knowledge and insights. Whereas I think people often usually see these four words, the nichnas yain yatsa sod, as more of like, you know, when you start drinking, just like your barriers are undone, and you can just say whatever you want. So there's something to be said for both of those, which I think is really fascinating. Okay, speaking of fascinating, I am deeply fascinated by this statement by Rabbi Hanin, who said wine was created only in order to give comfort to mourners and to reward the wicked. Okay, we could just stop there. That is deeply, deeply, deeply fascinating, because on the one hand, first of all, who said wine was needed to be created for any purpose at all? That's the first question I have. But the second is, wait, you're saying that there's a very utilitarian purpose for wine to be created, and these particular people, but what about everybody else? And certainly we just saw these couple other texts that, you know, there's certain wisdom and certain, you know, even God-like status that we can achieve as far as our actions and our activities. But this is really interesting. To comfort mourners and to repay, sort of recompense or reward the wicked, which is so fascinating, as it says. So, and then it goes on, give beer to him that is ready to perish, and wine to the bitter of soul. Let them forget his poverty, and remember his misery no more, from Proverbs chapter 31. This is, first of all, the Proverbs verse is deeply fascinating in and of itself. It's I don't know, very similar to each other. And the first, it starts off by saying, give beer to this person who's lost, as it were, and give wine to one who's bittered of soul. I find deeply fascinating about that phrase is that beer, which is bitter, do you give it to the bittered of soul? No, you don't give a bitter thing to someone who's bittered. You actually give wine to someone who's embittered, because wine can, you know, make them happy, and then you give beer to the other person. Really fascinating. But going back to the rabbinic text, going away from the biblical text, is that here also what's really fascinating is Rabbi Hanin doesn't even mention the beer aspect. He only talks about the wine. He's just so weno-centric. He doesn't even mention the beer. And yeah, for comforting mourners. So there are some, as it turns out, Tanaitic texts, some early rabbinic texts that talk about drinking in the mourning house, and that there being certain drinking customs that went along. I'll just give you a little tease, which is that in Ketubot, it talks about 10 different cups of wine being set aside for drinking in the mourning house. And so they definitely had a culture at the time that in the drinking house, the mourning houses, that they would consume wine. So here, to comfort mourners, so the mourners would drink wine, and that was just part of the culture, as well as to repay the wicked. Clearly wicked, I don't think we have any concern or worry that they indeed do drink, but also that that is their reward. They have nothing else coming in the subsequent world. Okay. All right, we got two further statements, and that's going to wrap it up for us for this 47th episode of JewishDrink.com podcast. We have Rabbi Hanin Bar Papa. Rabbi Hanin's son of Papa said, anyone in whose house wine does not flow like water is not included in the blessing. as it is said, and he shall bless your bread and your water. Okay, just as bread may be purchased with second tithe money, so too water may be purchased with second tithe money. What is that? Wine. One may buy wine with second tithe money, but one may not buy water. Nevertheless, it calls it water. This teaches that if, I mean, that's such a, like, okay, it's pretty intricate. If wine flows in a person's house like water, there's a blessing, but if not, there's no blessing. Okay. Clearly, this is, you know, if you live in a house in which you have, you know, I think most people, if you have wine in your house, you're gonna give it out. You're gonna measure it. You're not gonna worry. You are gonna worry about how much you're pouring, versus water. Water always, you know, you don't really care as much how much someone drinks. But if someone is just drinking, guzzling your wine, I think that's a concern, because I think in pretty much almost any culture, wine carries a certain, it's precious, right? It carries some certain value, whereas water doesn't carry the same amount of value, and you're not as worried. So here it's saying, look, if you're in someone has such wine that they're not concerned about how much is being consumed, it's not being drunk, that's a wonderful blessing, that you've attained such material possessions and value that you have so much wine and you're not worried how much of it gets drunk. You've attained blessing. And I fully co-sign that. I'm not there. You know, who knows, maybe one day, one decade, I'll achieve such level of material wealth. That would be amazing. I very much agree with Rabbi Chanin Bar Papa. Would love to achieve that level one day. Just have the wine flowing. Don't even care. All right, we're going to wrap it up with this. Rabbi Eli said, with three things someone is recognized: one, with their cup; two, with their pocket; three, with their anger; and then some say also with one's laughter. But it doesn't really work so well in English. I think to get a better sense of exactly what Rabbi Eli is working with here is actually in the Hebrew, which is B'shlosha Devarim Adam Nikar. So three things a person is recognizable, or sort of their temperaments ascertained. B'koso, v'kiso, v'kaso. Let me say that again. B'koso, v'kiso, v'kaso. If I said those 5 times fast, 3 times fast, 4 times fast, it'd be really hard to distinguish what these are. They're very similarly sounding in Hebrew, and yet they are actually really quite fascinating when you think about it. So of course we have one's cup, which I'll get to in a moment. V'kiso, their money. How do they spend their money? Are they thrifty with their money? Do they just spend it on anything? Do they buy the finest clothes? Do they give money to charity? How do they spend their money, right? What are their financial values? And the v'kaso, how do they come to anger, right? Are they quick to anger? Are they cool? Are they calm, reserved? How quick they are to anger? I want to go back, of course. This is really, we're focusing on the cup, which is the cup. How are they with the cup? First of all, do they ever drink? There are people who don't drink, and there are people who drink on a daily basis. And then there's everybody else in between that drink on some sort of basis, whether it's just social events, whether it's, you know, in a religious context, whether it's really just for Kiddush. It's really something, you know, how much are they drinking? I think one of the really fascinating things is to take all three of these aspects of v'koso, v'kiso, v'kaso together, right? When they are drinking, how do they spend their money, and how do they get angry, right? Are they quick to anger? Are they one of the drinkers who are like cool with everybody? Are they an angry drunk? Are they spending money? Are they, you know, buying rounds for the whole bar? Are they only spending on themselves? Like what? You know, I love that when you can actually mix all three of those together at one fell swoop. But I don't know if that's how Rabbi Eli meant that you can, I mean, really, look, if you go to a bar, you can measure all three of these things, and you can even throw in laughter on top of that, which is even more fascinating. But taken on its own, the koso is certainly something that it's really fascinating, a way to judge someone or to ascertain someone's character through their drinking habits. So I want to say, so that's going to wrap it up for us. So just as a recap, okay, so I'm just going to recap this. We have 3 major sections. One is ruling while drinking wine. really, it wasn't that intricate of a conversation, really. It starts off with Rabbi Yehuda quoting Shmuel, who says, once you have a few ounces of wine, you really shouldn't be providing halachic guidance. And then we have Rav Nachman, who said, oh, I don't even start until I drink. But he recanted. He said, I'm sorry, all right, I'll take that back. But then we get really huge into what about praying under the influence, right? What about praying and drinking? And yes, we do have this incident involving Rabban Gamliel, which is actually doesn't have to do with prayer, but it is still significant in the broader discussion. And we do have buzzed versus drunken prayer, which is buzzed prayer shouldn't be done, but is okay, whereas drunken prayer is both problematic and also exempt, right? So someone who is drunk is exempt from prayer at the time, okay? And then we also have we have that little section on praying with booze around. And then finally, this really cool 5 little statements at the end of the sugya about drinking and wine, and some really, those are like just good to have just good to have around, whether it's the nichnas yain yatzasod aspect, whether it's the how can someone be recognized, and finally this really fascinating piece by Rebbe Chanin about wine was only just created for the nichum avelim, for the comforting of mourners, as well as the repayment of the wicked. So it's quite an interesting sugya when you think about it in Eruvin 64 and 65. A little bit of prayer, a little bit of guidance, and a little bit of potpourri. So this was good. I hope you. I hope this was good. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and l'chaim.